this is the Inside Talk series focused on, the major social problems that, can use additional insight into how the world works and how the, potential outcomes of our intervention decisions. And as part of the series, we have Louise Fox, who's been working a lot in, development and labor markets. And take it away. Let you hear what you have to say.
Okay, thanks, Greg, and thanks for inviting me. This is kind of an interesting idea for me. This is not my usual audience of economists and policymakers, so I think it's great. And Greg, when we originally talked, you said to talk about what interests me, what excites me. So that's what I'm going to try to share with you guys today. And my passion is the youth employment challenge in sub-Saharan Africa. I would say that most of the research I'm going to present is pre-COVID work. I have done a blog on the Brookings website about what might happen to employment and youth with the shutdown of COVID, and we're updating some of that research, but I just need to say that. So what I'm going to share with you is my experience about how new and better data combined with an effective framing, I have to say, reshaped the discussion in Africa about youth employment and what to do. Having said that, there is, of course, much more to do. So it's not like we're done here. Okay, now tell me something. Why my slides are moving. I thought my slides weren't moving. Okay, so this is a slide full of words, which is kind of boring. But the point is, the dominant narrative in 2012 is, my God, we've got all these youth. We've got this youth bulge. You can see that discussion in my blog. And so what are we going to do? All these youth are unemployed. These unemployed youth create conflict, and they go become soldiers, and they have no skills, and they need skills training. And then if we give them skills training, somehow they'll get a job and be happy. That was the dominant narrative. Now, there are lots of assumptions underpinning that, most of which weren't true. First of all, I'm not going to present the evidence today, but you can see it in some of my other work. Youth are not unemployed. They're actually employed. The real problem is they're underemployed, so they're not working enough hours, or so we would call that in the US involuntarily part-time. Part of that is seasonality, or they're making low earnings. And they do have skills. And the skills training, it turns out, that was being provided was very expensive. And it turns out that the wage and salary jobs weren't there. So I'll show you a few graphs about that. So here, this graph I prepared in 2013. This is actually, the data are basically 2010, 2011. This graph took me in 2013, 9 months to prepare. 9 months. That's pretty bizarre. Yeah, exactly. Why is that? Because I had to use household survey data. The data were inconsistent. They measured it complete, and to make consistent data with the same assumptions about labor force participation, et cetera, across Africa, it took us 9 months. And that by itself is why policymakers and governments and stakeholders never really understood the problem, is nobody had the patience to sit down and do that data. Now, that's, we can say, a crime that it took 9 months. Okay, but I did it. And I showed, hey guys, this is where Africa's working. And where Africa's working is a lot most people in Africa say their primary employment is in agriculture. And a whole bunch of people say their primary employment is household enterprises. These are enterprises that are kind of either self-employment or self-employment just with the family. And they don't necessarily operate out of the house. They could have like a little kiosk or something, or they could have a market stall, or they could be roving the streets. If you've been to a developing country, those people who rove the streets. We call those household enterprises too. But it's basically non-farm stuff. That's where most people working. And the people working for wages in industry is this tiny, tiny yellow rectangle. And so all the training was going to train people for that, but those jobs didn't really exist. These wage service jobs includes the public sector, of course, teachers and doctors and bureaucrats and whatever, as well as people working in finance and IT and retail. Retail and commerce are big, transportation, etc. So basically, they didn't have an idea of what the situation was even on the ground, even though billions were being invested in interventions. So when I put this,
to nail down this data. First of all, who are resource rich? I'm not familiar with that term.
Oh, sorry. Those are countries that's about 8 or 10 countries, I forgot, that have their mineral exports, minerals, so oil, gas, or hard minerals like copper, tin, are, I think our threshold was over 75% of their export earnings. And so there are a lot of there are a lot of problems with it. We call that syndrome the resource curse, right? So basically, the reason we separated them out is that because of the resource curse, their exchange rate is too high and there's a lot of corruption. And so economic development is damaged. So they look rich, right? Most of these are lower middle income countries, meaning a per capita income over about $1,000. But they look richer, but they're not richer. Really, the people are very poor and their development is retarded because it's really held back because of the resource curse syndrome.
And now, so first of all, the data set, these are country level census data, not individual, because you're stratifying by countries.
Household surveys, sample surveys, country level sample surveys. Census, being a short questionnaire, doesn't actually ask enough detailed information. So in Africa, the census captures labor force participation, because if you ask an African, selling stuff by the side of the road, do you work? Do you have employment? They'll say, no. If I did, well, I wouldn't be selling by the side of the road, right? But as an economist, that's work. That's an economic activity. So we have to ask the questions carefully. So these are
and now just probably I'm trying to understand the data that's available. How do they work? You presumably can't just call a bunch of people, or can you? You have to show up there.
No, normally, okay. So these data are 10 years old now, and they go house to house. So this is sort of like the equivalent of the current population survey in the U.S., which they used to mail out. I don't know if they still mail out. They used to mail it out and have people fill it in. And then if people didn't mail, they'd go to the door and track them down, right? That's sort of what it is. And in Africa, you have, I've done this survey, or I've gone out with the surveyors because I don't speak the local language. I haven't done it myself. But you have a sample, you have a sampling frame, you draw a sample of households, you track down the household, depending on how long the survey is, you sit them down and ask them some questions. If it's on the labor market, you try to ask both the husband and the wife, or, all the adults, what they're actually doing. Because if you ask the wife what the husband's doing, and then you ask the husband what they're doing, it may not match, and vice versa the other way. The husband might say, oh no, my wife doesn't work. She just does household stuff. She goes to the field, whatever. Okay, right. So that's where these data come from. And this is still this is what I want to talk about. This is still the primary source for this kind of data to understand this kind of problem. Phone surveys are getting bigger and bigger, and they've certainly been helpful in the time of COVID. They tend to have an urban bias because that's who has cell phones. And also, you have the same problem as with censuses. You may not have time to have such a longer survey by the phone, right? So you may not, you have to design it carefully. I actually think phone surveys have been really helpful during this period of COVID to understand what firms are doing, because you can be shorter and quicker, and the firms are somebody in the firm always has a mobile phone. So.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay. So now then I did this projection of what the structure of employment would look like in 2020. By the way, I'm not so far off. And I showed people that, even under very optimistic assumptions about economic diversification and growth, there's not going to be very much change. And so basically, the only place, even in 2020, you're going to have a lot of wage employment is in the upper middle income countries. So this is like your South Africa's and income above that, Mauritius, those countries, right? So basically, if all you're focused on is trying to get youth into these jobs that aren't going to grow very much, you're leaving out all of these people, which is where youth are going to end up. And I can show you This is the projected net new jobs and gross job flows. What's the difference? Some people will leave the labor force and some people will enter. So the net is smaller than the gross. But basically what you're doing is you're busy trying to train people for the 4% of new jobs that are going to open up, and some of these jobs, and you're ignoring where, 75% of youth are going to end up working, whether they like it or not. That's just where the economic opportunities are going to be, because, and that's pretty, so this, when people saw that and looked at it, I mean, it took and I can show you again why that happens. That happens because countries are poor because they don't have a lot of firms, right? They don't have a lot of enterprises. If you think of like the poorest subsistence economy, the US in 1776, right? Most people worked out of their household, either as a farm or a business, or like a household grocery where they lived atop the grocery, or bakery where they lived atop, whatever. Small business, mom and pop, right? This is mom and pop, okay? And basically until you get pretty rich, you don't have a lot of wage opportunities. That's just true all over the world, not just of Africa. And so what happens is, so when I showed this to people at the time, I was working at the World Bank, and the World Bank was financing, putting all these data together and paying me to do this work, which was great. So when I started showing this around the World Bank, and then at the African Development Bank, and then at the UN, and to policymakers in countries, and traveling around countries in Africa and showing this and going to conferences, it kind of blew people's mind. But it also said, excuse me, what should we invest in now? What is our problem, and what should we invest in? So that's an example. But putting together that data is, I think, really expensive. Yes?
So let me understand this point. If most of job openings are in agriculture and just household enterprises, what do you need? Like, what's the training that needs to be done at all? And what's the goal of the training? It seems like agriculture, you may not need education to be, like it's going to be on-the-job training, but you may need completely different training to expand the economy as opposed to get the job.
Well, that's kind of a myth. I mean, look, to expand the economy, you have to get productivity here, because that's where most people work. So how do you get productivity here? Well, first of all, it's much more about basic education, basic skills, numeracy, literacy, and reasoning, right? And problem solving. It's also especially in the household enterprise sector, about soft skills, negotiating, problem solving, figuring out the issues, learning to work with suppliers, finding a network, etc. In agriculture, most people learn to farm from their family, right? But younger farmers who have more education tend to be able to use technology better. So, and they are able to use these mobile phone things that tell them what the prices are and where they can get a price, etc. So what it means is you ought to really be investing in basic education, and especially getting everybody like 9 years of education instead of 3, because they'll do better at these jobs. And training, like vocational training, the kind of vocational training that was being invested in, that costs 4 to 6 times as much as general secondary training. And so you're kind of wasting your money, and you could be training more people for this. That's the real point.
Maybe this is something you're going to get to later, which you tell me if that's the case. How do you evaluate? So if it's just vocational training, it's like, did they get a job? Yes, no. This is, were they smarter employees, and did the economy grow for the next 10 years? It seems like it's a much messier way of evaluating success.
It is messier, but I'm going to explain to you right now why that "did you get a job" is the wrong question and produces the wrong answer. Okay, so probably from your economics class, this is what you think about the labor market. So this is the supply curve of labor, and the higher the wage, more people will work. This is just kind of classic economics. And so if you expand the supply of labor, so if the supply of labor is growing because population grows and more people are entering the labor force, which is what's happening, the labor force in Africa is growing about almost 3% per annum, because there's been in the past high fertility, lots of kids, so now they're entering the labor force. If this demand curve isn't moving out, basically what happens is the wage should fall, in order for more people to be hired. If the wage doesn't fall, which is what most economists think, then what you have is just all these people are unemployed. So, whoops, they would, let me go back. All these people here would work for this, all these people here in this rectangle would work for this wage, and they're qualified, and employers would hire them, but they can't get a job, right? Because the demand curve isn't moving out, and that's why you need more firms. So what happens what happens if the wage is stuck? And the wage can be stuck not just because of minimum wages. The wage can be stuck because this is how much it costs to live in an urban area, take transportation, go to work, get dressed, etc. Right? I mean, this can be just like what we call a subsistence wage if you're going to live in an urban area, right? If you're going to live in San Francisco, you're not going to work for less than X amount because you've got to pay very high rent and then all the other costs you have of living in the city, etc. If you live in rural Alabama, the costs are lower, right? Okay, so what's been going on is that a lot of investment in vocational training moves this supply curve out, and it leaves the people who are qualified or don't get a job going from this area B to this area here. And so you basically expand the number of people. And basically what you do is you substitute some of these people here for some of these people here. So your impact evaluation said, our people got a job and the people who didn't participate didn't. Well, yeah, but maybe the people who didn't participate might have gotten a job and your people wouldn't have gotten a job if you hadn't spent, $5,000 per participant or even $1,500 per participant to kind of line them up and get them at the front of the queue. Right? So that's the problem with these impact evaluation studies. And we now have evidence that the graph right on the right is really how it works, how it looks. So since I put up this graph, people have been starting to do more impact evaluations and they randomize the firms. So we can see that it didn't increase hiring, this training, and it didn't increase increasing the supply of skilled people didn't actually increase investment because there are too many other issues related to capital and labor and technology and being an entrepreneur, a shortage of entrepreneurs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this idea of the training industry that supply creates its own demand. And it doesn't, frankly. It just, because there are too many, certainly not in Africa. But I have to say, figuring this out and demonstrating this, again, has been an expensive, time-consuming design, these impact evaluations. They can take 3 to 5 years to run. Impact evaluations can run $1 million or more. And so they've been great. And, our Nobel Prize winners in economics, Banerjee and Kramer and Esther Duflo, they invented this technique of impact evaluations and it took off and it's been great and it's really helped economics, but it's also a really expensive way to collect data. So that's kind of our problem at this point in terms of doing policy and doing interventions, is that figuring out everything seems to be very expensive because the data are expensive. I mean, we still rely a lot on survey data, although the survey have gotten better. I want to show you some. Go ahead.
Can you describe how impact evaluations work? Because I think it's unclear how you would, collect such data and tease out the
what you do, the typical thing for a training program is as follows. You announce, I'm offering a training program for people who meet these criterion. Maybe they have junior secondary, right? They've gone through middle school. They had 9-10 years of education. And we're offering it on these days, and we're offering it in, maybe in these, whatever, we're offering it, right? And we're offering it for free, which gets everybody, or we'll even give you a stipend if you'll take it, which gets a lot of people showing up. And so then you say, okay, more people showed up and qualified than we have places. So we randomly select the number of places we have, and then we randomly select an equal number to be our control group. And then you compare the outcomes for the control group, maybe 3 years later or 2 years later after the course and they've gotten a job. Now, some people in the control group will have gotten some other training or gotten a job or something, but you look to see a difference. And you usually get a difference, maybe 10% more, 20% more of the people who took the course got a wage and salary job. But my point is, big deal. All you did was move people from one box to the other. Whoops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. From one box to the other. That's all you did. And so, okay, maybe you might argue, yeah, but I got some women in. Oh, who wouldn't have gotten in? Okay, we substituted women for men. Are we happy? Maybe, maybe not. We can debate that. But you just need to know that's what you're doing. You're not creating new jobs. So anyway, and by the way, I might argue there were cheaper ways to substitute women for men. Cheaper training programs, cheaper alternatives. So anyway, it's been expensive, but we've pretty much confirmed that that's what goes on. So now I want to show you some new data that I have. Again, this was very expensive data to collect. This was financed by the World Bank in 7 countries in Africa. And they went to these households every month to find out exactly how many hours people were spending on different activities. Okay, think about how expensive that is, right? And in rural Africa and in urban Africa. Okay, so here we found out, remember I showed you everybody was working in agriculture. That's because they said, yes, my primary employment is in agriculture. But actually, their hours, according to hours, that may not have been where they spent their most hours. So the average number of activities, if we think about farm wage, off-farm wage, and non-farm household enterprise, the average number of activities people in rural areas have is about 1.6, 1.5, 1.6, in some areas 1.7, meaning many, many people are doing 2 things during the year, right? During the rainy season, the rains come, they plant, they harvest, then there's a whole, unless they have 2 seasons and 2 growing seasons and they're in rain or irrigation, they are doing something else. They are selling stuff, they're going to work, casual labor in construction, they're building someone else's house, they're running a bar or a kiosk or something. And very often what happens, the family is doing 2 things. So maybe at harvest time, all the adults are harvesting, but most of the whole year, they're also running a small bar or kiosk or whatever. And, the women, or they may be doing something like cutting hair, and everybody has, or braiding hair, or dressing hair, everybody has money to get their hair done after harvest because they have money, right? Or maybe they're making clothes or repairing clothes or whatever. Everybody has, or maybe they're doing crafts, making stuff that people want, or maybe they're just selling stuff. 40% are in retail, but everybody has money to buy out after harvest. So that's why they do 2 things. So what this graph, and again, this graph is now blowing people's minds in Africa, because what it's saying is even in rural areas, less than 50% of the hours worked are in agriculture. There's some farm wage in Africa. This is African data. There's some farm wage. There's a surprising amount of off-farm wage. And this is mostly casual labor. And then they're running an enterprise, right? And also in urban areas, there are a lot of people running enterprises, and it tends to be females because the males are getting the wage job. Partly that's because it takes more education, and partly because of occupational segregation, discrimination, etc. Also flexibility. Women may choose this because given their care economy responsibilities, they got flexibility. They cannot open their store in a day when they need to take the kid to the doctor or something. So anyway, this is telling a very different story. And you can ask, okay, but Louise, were you wrong in 2014 when you published your book? No, I used the best data I could. But now we know that although most people are in rural areas and many of the youth are staying there, we probably need to focus, even in rural areas, more on this green area, on those kind of jobs. Okay, so that's and what this also tells you is, again, all the latest fads. The latest fad is coding for girls. Okay, sorry, 1% of the jobs are in ICT. Thank you very much. Now, of course, ICT skills are used in other sectors. But having said that, 1% of employment today in Africa is in ICT. So, again, let's not neglect the rest of it. Okay, so I just wrote up some slides on what are the current questions on employment in Africa that we're struggling with. And we're struggling with how to answer them. And as I said, collecting the data is expensive. Sometimes collecting the data is more expensive than the analysis. And the macro level are like how to transform these economies, what combination of policies and investments are needed, and what could be the sequencing. So like, do we need roads or do we need to change the financial sector, better regulation, or what do we need, right? And then what analytical techniques would help, what data would test the hype do we need? And, they're like, we need data at the city level, how to make cities work and support the transformation. There's a lot of discussion about smart cities. Would that really help? Is that really the problem? Or is it really the incentives of the people who use the data who are in government, right? Smart cities, fantastic. But what about the people in government? Maybe they will reject the data or not pay any attention. Maybe the data is going to say you have, a huge water main leak or you're having you're losing water in this area every day. You need to fix that. And they'll say, whatever. I don't like that area. It's where the poor people, So we have lots of questions, and I just put them at the end. And what I want to end with is the question for you maybe to think about, which is, are we at the golden age of data for development, or are data still like gold? What do economists mean by that? Not a shiny object. Economists mean rare and expensive and hard to get. So I think that's kind of where we're struggling. And a lot of the issues around things like phone surveys, a lot of economists are working with the data that show mobility, where people are moving around the city, et cetera, et cetera. But to really understand what's going on, we need to be able to disaggregate it in different ways, by demographics, for example. And especially if you're concerned about youth, by demographics. And the other thing we need to do is we need to have a bunch of other variables. So we need to know something about the kind of people who are getting the job and who are more productive on the job. Where did they get their education? What kind of parents did they have? Did they have educated parents? Where did they grow up? What do they do with the rest of their time? Et cetera. So household surveys, expensive household surveys, like the kind of data I use, are still actually really important, and we haven't been able to get rid of them. But we still need to do a lot of survey research. The topic that I'm working on now with the Hewlett Foundation, how to empower more women in Africa. This is about as much about norms and mindsets and beliefs, and because you have to believe that there's going to be a censure for violating the norms, or it's not a norm, right? So, and it's hard to ask those questions. We have psychologists have invested in this big five and whole bunch of socioeconomic skills, and they've tried all over the world, and they said, oh, it works all over the world, even in poor countries. Well, yeah, because you tried it on college students in Africa. But when you go to farmers in Kenya, the big five questions don't work at all, because they don't understand the questions. They don't give consistent answers. And with different interviewers, they get different answers. So we still also need to do a lot of survey research. Now, I think that survey research will then allow us to do more with phone surveys. Collecting data is not cheaper, but we're getting more reliable data through tablets, data entry in the field. You can cross-check to see if somebody's giving inconsistent answers during the survey. The supervisor can better supervise the interviewers. So all of that is making some difference. Definitely technology is making some difference, but I've yet to see it's made a much bigger difference to me in the US when I look at how economists are using data and what questions they're answering than how we're able to do it in developing countries. But I'm happy to take questions. I see we have a few people on, and I'm happy to take your questions or comments, or I'd like to have a discussion, and you can tell me what you're thinking about. I'd like to hear that too. So here's our thank you slide with the picture of the girl we have on the cover of our book.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. Probably maybe one thing that you list a whole ton of future directions, but maybe a foundational idea that I think will kind of clarify this is how do labor markets and fit into the economy? How do family histories fit into this? Like, it seems like you're studying this stuff, but what's kind of, do you have a sense of the dynamics of this? I mean, or how the political system relates and corruption relates to these training programs and investments?
So the political system is very important. I'm actually starting another project on the political economy of resource-rich countries and why labor markets are so, and employment opportunities are so hindered there. And more importantly, what could be done about it? Because a number of African countries are discovering more resources. So the question is how Ghana can avoid being Angola or Nigeria, right? That's the question that I'm working on, or Senegal or Kenya, right? And so the political system is very important. The political system is very important because, for example, to stop doing the wrong thing and start doing the right thing means reform. It means change. And there are interest groups, and those interest groups are benefiting. There's a whole bunch of people benefiting from the dysfunctional vocational training industry in Africa, right? I mean, there may be earmarked funding for ministries of labor that they get to dole out and collect favors for that. There are teachers that are teaching, they're building, this is whole network. So to get change, you need political leaders who are willing to disrupt the system in a way. Education systems are unbelievably difficult to change. If you have kids, you know that about the US, but it's also true in Africa. And the educational systems need to change and need to teach more socioeconomic skills, soft skills, etc. They focus a lot on rote training, and that is not building the kind of skills that we need. So it's not only that they need to teach 21st century ways, skills like, computers and digital stuff. They need to change their whole way of teaching. And, who's in an education bureaucracy? Who's in a ministry of education? Well, they're people who've been teachers and who've gone to teachers' college, right? I mean, they have a whole, right? So, in my profession, if you want to disrupt the economics profession, okay, some economists have disrupted it, but also people who had experience in other disciplines have disrupted it. Like psychologists have started, when economists started working with psychologists, it disrupted things a bit, thank God. So the political system is super important. What are the incentives for change? How do you get, cities don't really work in Africa. Why? Well, it's partly a failure of collective action, but it's also because the national level is unwilling to empower mayors and city councils because it could be another source of power to threaten their power, right? So, so the political system is really important. But the family history matters in the US. There's a lot of discussion about mobility and who has mobility and why. And of course, it matters in Africa too. If you grew up in a rural area as a child of the elite, you obviously have more opportunities, just like in the US, if you grow up in a low-income family with maybe only one parent, by the time the kid is 3, they haven't learned as many words as if they grow up in, Silicon Valley parents, right? Who are reading to them and talking to them, and the kid is listening to them talk, and they learn more words. Well, the same thing is true if you grow up in a rural area versus if you grow up in a city, right? So family history and your and networks are really important, even more important in Africa than in Silicon Valley. So, you have to develop those networks. So how labor markets work? Well, the way to think about it is in most countries, most people don't actually have a chance to enter the labor market. There are not enough people wanting labor for someone to be able to sell their labor, their most important asset, and their human capital, as we call it as economists, to someone outside of their family. So they end up creating their own job, right? And they decide to have a business, or they decide to go into whatever they see as their opportunity. And so the real point is I think a number of us have concluded that urban labor markets work pretty well. For entry-level jobs, firms have no trouble hiring. Now, firms do complain about skill shortages. Mostly they're complaining about lack of socioeconomic skills and so-called employability skills. People knowing what to do when they get to work, right? Can they work in teams, blah, 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 all the things all of that sort of stuff. But then also the skill shortage tends to be at the higher experience levels. So if you want an experienced accountant, there will be a skill shortage because not that many entered the labor force 10 years ago, right? And so it's that level where you want an experienced construction supervisor. Well, you probably need to bring it in from India because, not that many. Now, the idea is to get the guy you bring in from India to train the younger people. But at the entry level, it's not such a problem. It's more these experience. And management is a huge deficiency in Africa. Economists have now established that pretty well, that there's huge management deficiencies. And, I lived in China for 3 years at one point during my World Bank career. And then I came back to the US and started working on Africa. And people said, why can't China be like Africa? And I kind of laughed because China has 3,000 years, right, to build up a bureaucracy, to learn what it takes to succeed, to watch people being entrepreneurial and succeed. All those things, tacit learning, we call it, learning by doing, learning by watching. It had 3,000 years to build it up. Africa's had like 50, okay, maybe 60 now. I mean, it just takes time. So and you really see that in management deficiencies. And you don't see, for example, African companies learning enough from their suppliers compared with companies in other countries, for example. We see other areas like that. And, classroom training doesn't fix that. The only thing that fixes it is pretty expensive kind of mentoring, wraparound kind of services. And even sometimes that doesn't take because, a family business say, well, okay, but we don't want to do really know how it counts and tell us. Because then somebody else is going to see our books and we don't want anyone else to see our books. We just want to run it our way. So it's a struggle.
So before I move on, Luna, did you have a question?
Yeah, hi, Louise. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's super interesting. My name is Luna. I'm actually also a PhD student at Berkeley in development economics. I work with Ted Miguel a lot, so have done a lot of impact evaluation work. My question is kind of sort of to your point that you think supply side interventions are not going to be the cure to the unemployment problems. What are the demand side interventions that you think are promising? Like, do you think the programs like the Youth Opportunities Program would be like good candidates, or is it about like creating entrepreneurial opportunities for farmers or for people in rural areas? What's your take on, what are some of the promising interventions?
Hi, Luna. Nice to meet you. And by the way, we can, of course, connect again. I tend to tune in to the seminars, the graduate seminars.
Awesome.
On Tuesdays that Ted runs.
Yeah.
So maybe we've been in some of the same seminars.
Yeah.
That's great. So, Ted Miguel is actually kind of one of my heroes because he did this 10-year research in Kenya that really showed that this technical and vocational training doesn't work. And it was such an interesting project that he did with Joan Hicks and Isaac Mbiti, where, the idea was, okay, there are returns, economists run a regression. There are high returns to vocational education. We should do vocational education. Okay, so then Ted randomizes who gets to go to a voucher to go to vocational education schools and then studies them for 10 years and doesn't see any difference. Actually, the ones that didn't go to the school had more money than the ones that did for the first 5 years because at the time the ones that did lost going to school, right? And so what that means is that what we saw before was complete selectivity, right? And I just thought that was one of the most important. If I were to nominate one of the most important studies in development economics, I know everybody wants to nominate worms, and that's important, but I might nominate that as one of the best. Also, his work with Catherine on electricity, I'd nominate as one of the best. Okay, so entrepreneurship. You know, like I just think a lot of people are going yak about entrepreneurship and duping. I mean, youth entrepreneurs are not going to save Africa. First of all, how do you learn to be an entrepreneur? Well, the best way is actually to work for people for a while. I know Mark Zuckerberg didn't do that, although maybe he had a summer job in high school. I don't know. But otherwise, most people who are successful at running a business, they work for someone else. They learned how to run a business, and then they started running businesses, right? So all this entrepreneurship training, I think, is again selling youth a story. It's fixing youth. I know the Youth Opportunities Program very well. I've looked at all the evaluation. You have to remember that the initial good results they got for the first 5 years has to do with they were in a conflict country where the conflict had been settled, and now the economy was opening up. And also, these were specially selected youth groups. So the village nominated their top 8 youth, right? And those were selected. So I don't think if you plot that program in the middle of Kampala, Uganda, you would get the same results. Having said that, I think it's obviously an interesting model for a post-conflict situation. No, we need to do a lot more work about how to create more firms and how to get those firms growing and increasing their productivity. Why there isn't much new firm entry in Africa? What are the and this issue of new firm entry has to do with the current economic elite trying to keep competition out, right? What do firms do? The idea that firms want competition is nuts. Firms don't want competition, right? You saw that yesterday on Capitol Hill, right? They don't want competition. They want to keep firms out, competition out. And so I have been wanting to do a piece of work for some time and have not had time to do it. But I still think it needs to be done to really look in a few countries at what is the job cost of some of the barriers to entry that countries have.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you so much.
Sure. But by the way, the work on management and how we know management isn't any good has been done partly by who's at Stanford? Nick Bloom is at Stanford, or Von Reenen is at Stanford? One of the two is at Stanford. And they've done a lot of that work.
Yeah. Very expensive consulting for sure. I think they're focusing mostly on bigger firms, so probably not the typical firm that would exist in rural areas or
Okay, so here's the deal. Medium and large firms survive. They create the most jobs when they start, and they do not start as micro firms. Micro firms do not start selling stuff by the side of the road and grow up to be ShopRite or Safeway, the Safeway equivalent. This does not happen. Medium and large firms start at least medium size and grow, and they create a lot of employment. So we've got to focus on those firms. I wouldn't necessarily hire them as consultants, but I think the research is really important, and their techniques they've used for their research are really good. So we've got to focus on those if we want more wage and salary jobs. In rural areas, I think a lot of work that actually has been done by people in the in ARE on why farmers don't use technology, how to get technology that works and raises their productivity, how to get the goods to market and establish all of those things in the agricultural value chain have been really important. And we know that one of the reasons why agro-processing doesn't happen in Africa, it happens outside of Africa often, is because that supply chain from the farmer to the agro-processor, who's probably in an urban area or at least a secondary city, doesn't work very well. So we have to kind of fix those kinds of things, I think, for rural areas.
Yeah, totally. Do you think this also would have something to do with infrastructure?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a lot of evidence that rural roads help farmers a lot,
Mm-hmm.
a whole lot, because they make transportation cheaper, but they also have like something that has only recently been measured. They bring innovation in.
Mm.
But I just read a new blog or something about, or a new piece of research that was quite interesting. I don't know where I read it, somewhere on the internet, NBR or somewhere, about how fragmented the input supply chain is and how that increases the price to the farmer so much. I think it was a study on Kenya, and how they need to get it from the first entry point to the village without so many middlemen, so that the price can fall.
Mm-hmm. Super cool. It's really helpful for me to get like a bird's eye view of this literature, because I feel like I hear a lot of like research studies that are fairly specific, and this is just great. Thank you.
Yeah, and it seems really difficult because I see so many gaps where I hear like here's a connection here, like here's a problem, and it's really unclear what the where interventions will be most effective, because it seems like there's a lot of guesses, and now you've debunked one of those guesses, right? But how difficult is it to debunk them all? Because it seems like a very like data intensive, data collection intensive kind of process.
It's that problem of sequencing is really hard.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be the same in every country, in every situation, because there are a lot of variables that are involved. So part of it is political. Some of it's opportunistic, right? Where do you have fertile ground for an innovation and you can make a difference, and where don't you? So that is a really tough problem. And I think there are real limits to impact evaluation on some of these more sectoral level and sequencing questions. So that will need to do more observational studies, et cetera.
Well, how do you do? I mean, you mean sequencing like in this intervention, that kind of stuff, right? Now, those seem like a decade-long process. So, how do you even study that kind of stuff?
Well, you study it over the decade, and you make sure you collect the data so you can study it. There are countries, right, that have made this transition. And so you can study those other countries. Then you have to decide what was specific about the countries that made it work. And, like when people say, why can't Africa be like China? It's like, okay, there are some specific things. Big country, 3,000 years of history, et cetera, right? So, but you have to decide, okay, but what can we learn? Like, for example, special economic zones to build up light manufacturing. Why did they work well in China, and why have they never yet to work effectively? Although maybe they're working in Ethiopia, but why have they yet to work in Africa? Okay, we can study that and at least figure out what went wrong and why it always went wrong, and see, okay, can we tweak this intervention to solve those problems, or is it in the nature of the beast that we can't? I mean, it went wrong because of politics, basically. And so is it in the nature of the beast, or can we tweak it? Let's see.
Well, let me transfer this to the developed world, where you still have development and training kind of things, but hopefully you have more data or easier access to data that might illuminate how, the more data poor environments operate. So if you were like in America, how would you tease out these things? How much easier might it be to tease out these things?
So first of all, I got to say, everything I've said about technical and vocational training in Africa doesn't apply to the U.S.
Yeah.
Because the whole system is very different, and it's run as a public-private partnership. A lot of it's run through the community colleges, and the whole system works better at building skills. And also you have universal secondary education. So you have a base. To teach someone to be an electrician, they got to be able to read, write, understand math, and some science, right? Otherwise, they're going to make a lot of mistakes. Just
right.
Simple stuff. Okay, so I just want to say that about the U.S. Actually, the U.S. has had in the past a terrific system of collecting data about households and firms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's published mostly centered on the Commerce Department. So you have the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you have the Department of the Census, you have the Census of Manufacturing, you have payroll data, you have unemployment data. All of that is put out all the time. You have leading indicators, you have consumer confidence, you have tons of different data. And then the whole industry of market research is hugely developed in the US. And a lot of that market research data is proprietary, but sometimes it gets published, or a researcher can use some of it. And it also can be very helpful to know about household behavior. And then this whole big data revolution in the US, we are able to use that in interesting ways. But like all this, so now what's the big issue in the US? Why are certain demographics more affected by COVID than others? Okay. Well, at first we didn't even know that because the government wasn't collecting the data. There is no substitute for the public sector collecting the data and performing that role. You cannot get that very easily from cell phone data. You know, your cell phone doesn't say if somebody's sick. A lot of this search, the data that you guys produce about who's searching and what people are searching for in what area, that helps us a lot, right? And now we know we can also measure it through the sewers, and we're getting smart toilets. You know, there are all kinds of innovations that are happening in the US. And I see them every day around COVID, for example, that are super interesting to me, where you can see a rapid response to the problem, both in the research community and in the private sector. And actually, it's the public sector that is lagging in terms of how to help us. The public sector in Europe doesn't have as many demographics to collect the data on. But their system is, like in Scandinavia, their public health system is really developed to get that demographic data. And they figured out a lot of this stuff a lot faster. And that's how we learn from them and the Chinese, about men being more susceptible, older people, the death rates of older people. We've learned a lot from the data that came in from Scandinavian and German health systems, because they are. That's I think we know a lot about who's unemployed. The unemployment surveys also tell, you know, where they worked before, what their skills are. We know a lot about the unemployed also here. You do not have weekly unemployment surveys in Africa. Well, not very many people are unemployed, so it'd be a waste of money, right? I've argued that they should just do labor force surveys in urban areas and try so they could do them more frequently, and forget about trying to do them. But you know, that argument hasn't won the day yet. But.
What value is flow of people from one occupation to another? Because that's the direction you have not discussed yet.
Oh, that's very important. So you may or may not have seen the research coming mostly out of Harvard and MIT on what's been the impact of robots, and have there been job gains or job losses. All of that comes from the flow from people reporting occupations, right? Mm-hmm. And things like the current population survey and other labor data. They report occupations. As occupations rise or fall, and then we look at we have detailed data on the skill basis of those occupations. Then we can tell where robots are entering in and whether they're creating jobs or destroying. What's the net job impact of robots? Okay, that's one way we do that. We also collect what's called panel data. So the same people might be surveyed for several months or a year or whatever. And we can, people might be surveyed once a year for 3 years or something. So we get some idea of who's changing jobs and where they're changing jobs to. Finally, we're actually able to match people up in the census data, and researchers can get access to it. You can't take it home on your home computer. You have to go use it, I think, mostly at the Department of Census, which is why it's mostly done on the East Coast. But they'll give you matched census data, and you can track people in the census. They have ways to anonymize it, so you can't exactly find out who it is. And anyway, you can't take it with you, so you can't go take it and then go look for these people in this small town. But that's another way we track. That's one of the main ways we track mobility, for example.
Okay, that's helpful. So, but now one thing you just brought up is job displacement due to automation, and that's, I mean, for Alphabet, it's huge because it's doing a lot of that work, and also is very concerned about the mitigating that impact. So, what is the current consensus? How does that working?
Well, it depends upon where you are. Let me just say one more thing. In the U.S., everybody since like 1950 or something has had a social security number. That's a universal personal identification number, which helps you track people.
Yeah.
In 1950, there weren't even birth registries in Africa, right? And so most Africans don't have a universal identification number. You probably followed that was initiated in India, and it's made a big difference. You probably followed a lot of that. It was set up by the Infosys guy. So anyway, I just want to put that on the table. Now, robots. Okay, so in the US, there's no question at all that a certain set of jobs have been lost to robots, and a certain other jobs have been created by the automation. Those jobs are sort of high skill. Those jobs are more like your jobs. Those jobs are high skilled jobs, and the jobs that have been lost are the medium skilled jobs for people with high school education, because it's routine stuff that gets automated. Now, we're also losing some agriculture jobs to automation, and I hope we lose more and more of them to automation, because those are terrible jobs. We have to have illegal immigrants basically to do them, because they don't pay well, and they are dangerous, and there are all kinds of problems. It's much better to have robots spraying the crops at night and pick, whatever, than because agriculture is very dangerous. And so some of the jobs that get lost, I feel like we're happy to have them lost. But others, if you're one of the people who lost your job to robots, you're not happy. So in Africa, I'm not so worried about job losses, because the jobs weren't there to begin with, right? There wasn't an automotive factory or even an auto parts factory. So the jobs weren't there to begin with. So they're not really as likely to be lost. And the technology, the robots in agriculture are way too expensive for African agriculture right now.
Yeah.
They're basically bringing in a lot of the technology that's coming into Africa is coming in from China and India, which is good, because that's technology suited to that environment.
Makes sense. So we're pretty much at time. Does anybody else have questions? Okay, well then, thank you. This was incredibly enlightening. This was fascinating. Thank you very much, Louise.
Thank you. Great talk.
Sure, my pleasure. Great to talk with you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.